All right, we'll begin the committee meeting. It's unusual to have the Director of PERS and Miss Mississippi in the same meeting, so welcome to both of y'all. Director Higgins, if you would please come up and you could start your presentation.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. It's great to be here with you again. Look forward to talking with you this morning. It's always great to have a chance to come back and talk with Senate Finance, and we certainly appreciate your support of PERS. First thing, let me call your attention to a blue packet of information everyone should have. There's a wealth of information in there about the system with some of our standard publications. Certainly today, I won't go through all of that, but just want to call that to your attention to look over at your convenience. On the right side, you'll see some of our standard publications. On the left side, you'll see a copy of a letter, a recent letter to legislative leadership, relaying our legislative request for this session and other important and pertinent information. Again, we appreciate your support for PERS. Look forward to talking with you. I thought what I would do today, I know some of you have heard some of the information that I'll go over, but I also know there's some new members too, so hopefully it would be good to go through that again. But I thought I would aim to try to keep my remarks, because I know PERS is certainly a topic of interest always, but certainly this year. So I'm going to try to keep my opening comments to around 10 minutes or so, maybe a little less, and then open it up for questions. And I'll start by saying PERS is so very important, such an important system, not just to our membership, but to the state overall. We pay out over $3 billion annually in benefit payments to every county in the state. Over 90% of that money stays in the state of Mississippi, and it generates billions of dollars in economic impact. We also touch, with over 350,000 in total membership, we touch over 10% of the state's population directly, not even counting loved ones. So PERS is just so important, again, not just to the membership, but also to the state overall. And PERS is certainly stable, but we have to work together to keep it that way. There's no need for immediate alarm. We have over $32 billion in assets to pay benefits. Retirees can continue to count on their benefits. But when it comes to the long-term sustainability of PERS, the long-term outlook, I believe that we either need to fund it, change it, or eventually we may risk it. And that last option, of course, is not, that last comment is not an option. But long-term, for the long-term sustainability, revenue needs to increase, or the cost and liabilities need to decrease, or a combination of both. And I just think it's very important that we work together on solutions. I think it's important that we continue this very frank and realistic discussion that's ongoing about contribution rates and new tiers and funding possibilities and things of that nature. As far as an overview of the system, as I mentioned, we're around $32 billion in assets under management now. We have over 350,000 in total membership. We have over 115,000 retirees. We have around 146,000 active members paying into the system. And the average PERS benefit, including the cost of living adjustment, is around $27,000. Now, our funded ratio, and that's a popular pension metric, if you will, the actuarial funded ratio as of the last publication in December is around 56%. That's down from 61% in the previous year, the previous publication. But the reason for that is largely due to a change in the assumed rate of return. So nothing happened, nothing went wrong. There was no mishap or anything like that. It was just a change in the assumption. But it's very important to have good assumptions. I'm sure that'll come up later in maybe some of the questions and discussion, but that's the primary change there. But what I'll say in the same breath is the actuarial funded ratio for PERS has been roughly 60% for over the last 10 years. When I say roughly 60%, I mean low 60s or upper 50s. So it does vary some, but roughly the big picture has been about the same for over a decade. But referring to that 56% funded ratio, I want to talk about the other side of that equation, the other 44% or 40%, whichever number we're using. That percentage represents the unfunded liability. Now, the funded ratio overall is actuarially just showing your assets, what you have compared to what you need. The unfunded is the difference. It's the gap. It's the difference actuarially between what you need and what you have. And it's not uncommon to have an unfunded, but it's important to monitor it, manage it, make strides towards paying it off. For us, that unfunded for PERS is around $25 billion. And the reason I mention that and want to highlight that is to make sure and emphasize that when it comes to the employer contribution rate, the great majority of the employer contribution rate goes to pay for the unfunded. Again, the majority of the employer contribution rate goes to pay the unfunded liability. That was the driver behind the recent employer rate increase. That will likely be the driver for any future rate increases. And it's important to realize that it's that unfunded that is driving that. Now, how did we get here? How did we get to the 25 billion unfunded? First of all, PERS is an accumulation of everything financially that's happened since we were created about 70 years ago. But just to summarize on one hand quickly, the main factors over the last 25 years that help lead to the 25 billion unfunded would be this. It would be some additional benefits placed into law without additional, in no particular order, but additional benefits placed into law without additional funding at the time. Several economic downturns, including the Great Recession and also the dot-com bubble in the early 2000s. A declining active to retiree ratio, meaning fewer actives paying into the system, more retirees coming onto the system, and retirees living longer with improved mortality. And then a more conservative approach to public pensions in general. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It could be good for Mississippi, it could be good for the state, but it has a cost. So if you were to try to summarize on one hand, the factors that led over the last 25 years to the unfunded, that's how I would do it. It's not a totally exhaustive list, but it definitely covers the big ticket items. So as I begin to close out and start thinking about what would be the ideas or solutions or ways to address that, and we would say continuing to gradually increase the employer contribution rate as recommended by the actuary, consideration of a funding request. We ask that the legislature consider funding this year, some additional funding in whatever amount that you all eventually may deem appropriate and feasible. Any amount, especially anything on a recurring basis, would be very helpful and greatly appreciated. And then also we have a legislative package, some legislative requests this year that we hope to come back later in session and go through. I won't touch on them in detail today unless you prefer, but we have something proposed that touches our deferred comp program, our optional retirement program, and then a couple items dealing with PERS. The only one I'll highlight today to start with is a board-approved requested Tier 5. And by Tier 5, I'm referring to a new benefit structure for future employees hired at some point in the future. And the way that we request it in the board's legislative package is that this potential new benefit structure would be very, very similar to current PERS, except it would have 4-year vesting instead of 8. It would have a reduced member contribution rate, and then there would be no guaranteed COLA. Rather, there would be the possibility of a COLA tied to inflation, capped at 3%, and also based on funding availability at the time. So again, we appreciate the chance to be with you this morning. I thank you for your past and ongoing support of PERS, and I hope that you'll be supportive of the requested Tier 5 and other legislation later in the session. With that, Mr. Chairman, thanks again. We would be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, real quick, what is the contribution rate today?
17.4.
17.4, and it is going up to
19.4 July 1st.
July 1st of this year. So we got a 2% increase that'll start July 1.
That's correct.
Okay. You mentioned part of some of the possible solutions. You mentioned funding requests. Does PERS have an amount that y'all have requested for funding?
We didn't ask for a specific amount. We really would just welcome any amount that you all, again, would deem appropriate and feasible, certainly if it's on a recurring basis. I know in some of the discussions with various legislators, we've ran scenarios of 250 million for so many years or 500 and something million for so many years. We've looked at various numbers before, but we don't have a specific amount in the request.
And this is 250, 500 million consecutively given year after year after year after year for how long?
It could be. It would be whatever, as we work together through the process, and I certainly encourage us to work together on solutions and ideas, but it really would depend on what the legislature funds or how you all choose to fund it or what type of combination that we work together on. But whether it be 250 or 500 million for 5 years, or whether it's a $250 million on a recurring basis, it could be either or. We certainly welcome any amount. I know recurring has the most effect and impact, but we welcome any amount.
Well, my question is if it's 250 million, is it 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 30 years? Where is the end in sight in the additional, so that's 250 million over the 2% increase that's going to hit everybody. What would be y'all's projection, or what would be your estimation of where you would have to get it up to where you felt the funding level was such that you wouldn't need the recurring cash infusion on an ongoing basis?
Based on the last published actuarial report, the actuary has recommended that we continue to phase it in to 27.4%. So I guess based on the latest report, which I say, I'm emphasizing that because things change. You know, we can't predict the future. We don't know what's going to happen in the world or what's going to happen in the economy. But based on the existing assumptions, the existing information in the last report, the actuary has recommended we go up to continue to phase it into 27.4%. So I think the way I understand your question, I would say the 27.4, but that certainly could change. And in fact, some of our estimates continue to show the actuarially required amount going up in future years as well, just depending on what happens in the future.
So my understanding is that y'all were talking about a 5% increase, but now y'all are looking to want to impose a 10%.
Well, what you're referring to is last year or so when the actuary they recommended and the board approved going to 22.4% for the employee rate. And we have since voted to phase that in at 2% per fiscal year until it gets to that amount. So that's the 5% I think that you're talking about. Then as we lowered the assumed rate of return over the last year and the analysis throughout that discussion, it was anticipated that in lowering the assumed rate of return, that it would go up to roughly 27%. And now as time has gone by, the assumed rate of return has been lowered. The actuary's completed its report. So that's why the 27.4 has been recommended. So that's the difference in the 5 and 10, I think, that you're referring to. But yes, sir, as it stands right now, the only action the board has taken is to raise the rate to 22.4%, phasing it in at 2% per fiscal year till we get that amount. But the actuary has recommended that continue to go up to 27.4, but the board is not taking any action on that and may not do that, may not choose to do so until the 22 is fully implemented.
So we'll get there in 2.5 years, 3 years, we'll be at the 22.4.
That's right. 2, 2, and 1 fiscal year
2,
one.
2, and 1. Couldn't do a 1, 2, 2.
That's true. Yeah.
So
the longer you wait, the more it costs. But
so we're going to have. Do we know what the estimated impact is to the general fund on the 2% increase?
The 2% for each. I don't know the exact amount for the general fund. We could certainly work together with Elbow and get that. I will say the estimated amount for a 2% coming into PERS for all funds is around 149 million.
149 million. You talked about y'all lowered the actuarial numbers, and our funding ratio, our unfunded ratio went from 61 to 56. If we would not have, and I guess I'm trying to get this is more of a performance question year over year. We wouldn't have adjusted the metrics. What would our funding ratio have been this year if we didn't change it and go down to 50, which required it to go down to 56%?
I would actually have to go back and look at that and compare that, but it would have been roughly the same. It would have stayed close to that. I think it would have stayed close to that 61% in that same ballpark.
So there wouldn't have been any gain or any returns with the stock market over the last year.
Let me go back and check that, but I think there might have been a small increase. I need to probably just go back and check that since they did it at the lower assumed rate. I know the big picture would stay the same. We did have a positive return last year though, so there could have been a positive effect there.
All right. One of the things that we've talked about in the past, and I think the committee has brought up in prior sessions with you, is kind of a review of the investment portfolio, money managers. Can you speak to our investment portfolio, kind of where we are and the process with hiring money managers? Is that something that is done? How often do you revisit that?
Basically all the time in some ways. To speak of that again, it was 32 billion is the estimate of the total portfolio. Had a good investment year last fiscal year. The gross return was around 7.76%. To put that in perspective, the median return for other public pensions in our peer group greater than 10 billion was around 7.5%. If you look at a similar peer group of public pensions nationally over 25 billion, which is kind of us too, because again, we're over 30 billion now. The median was was close to 7%, where again, we were 7.76. Also, if you look longer term for our 5-year, our 10-year, our 15-year return, we exceeded our benchmark. And by that, I mean simply a comparison to the market based on our asset allocation. And we compare well to our other peers, other public pension funds. In the 15-year mark, or the 15-year time period, in our peer group, in looking at other public pensions, we ranked in the 8th percentile. So that would mean that in that particular data set, we outperformed 92% of other public pensions. Now, certainly always room to improve. We are not immune to what goes on in the world. We're not immune to the Great Recession. We're not immune to what goes on in the various markets. But all in all, investments, I believe, are well managed and managed regularly and ongoing, and had a good and a positive year last year. More about the process. We do have a very extensive process, and on selecting a manager, it basically starts with, strategically, we do an asset liability study every 5 years, using that to determine our strategic asset allocation, meaning the broad asset classes like equities or fixed income. Within that, we'll do a structure review around every 2 or 3 years, and that's breaking down what type of equities, public, international, or global. And then that'll get to manager selection. We have a small in-house investment staff, but we also have, and the board has, an outside investment consultant that does a lot of this work nationally, has been around 50 years, works with many other public funds throughout the country. And they have an extensive database of institutional managers that specialize in institutional management for public funds, public pensions, endowments, and things like that. And they'll start from a very broad list, the broadest universe possible, depending on the request, and start to narrow that down using quantitative factors such as performance and standard deviation and so on and so forth. Qualitative factors as far as experience and turnover of key staff and style and how it fits with the portfolio, and eventually screen that down to a list of semifinalists. And then once it is narrowed down and recommended based on an extensive list of quantitative and qualitative factors, the board will approve the manager, and then we have ongoing oversight. I mean, it's just regularly and at least before the board on a quarterly basis. And I hope that's, I was trying to take a very complex apparatus and narrow it down, but that's the broad strokes.
I'll ask the next obvious question. What are we spending on money managers?
Overall, and it's around 100 million a year. And that is a noticeable dollar amount, but you have to put it in perspective because it's I want to say last fiscal year, it was 0.32 or 0.33%. So $100 million roughly in total. But when you put that in perspective, it's a relatively small amount. That's equivalent to if you were to take the same 0.30 something percent and apply that to $100,000 in your own money that was being managed, it'd be roughly $30 a month. So $100 million or 0.30 something percent.
Where does that rank nationally with other pension systems as far as, I mean, is that good? Is that middle of the road? Is that high?
I will say appropriate, very much in the mainstream, or even in the good categories you say.
Appropriate is in the eye of the beholder. Where does it rank comparatively speaking with other pension systems?
I don't have an exact rank. What I can tell you is what we do, and it's been a couple of years since we completed it, and we're in the process of completing a new one now, which I'll be happy to share. But the last one, which was just a couple of years ago, and we would go back and look at our managers, all but one, I believe, from memory, ranked as far as a competitive cost better than the median compared to our public pensions. And the one that I think was a little higher was still adding value after fees. So to give you that perspective, it's not a total rank like a 1, 2, 3, but in comparing to other public pension funds and analyzing that, our costs were very competitive and better than the median at the last review.
And so when y'all analyze all your money investors, who is it the governing board of PERS that makes the selections? Is that?
Ultimately, it is the board that approves and terminates the managers, but that's done with a great deal of input from staff and the outside investment consultant.
Okay. And
that has specialization in these areas as well.
For the new members, how is your board constituted? What is the governing board made up of?
So we have 10 members of the Board of Trustees. One is the ex officio member, the elected state treasurer. Another is a gubernatorial appointee that's a member of PERS. And then we have 2, everyone else is elected by a certain constituency group. We have 2 elected by retirees, 2 elected by state employees, one elected by counties, one elected by municipalities, one elected by the institutions of higher learning, and then one elected by public schools and community colleges. And hopefully that should be all 10. So a total of 10, 8 are elected, and then the state treasurer and a gubernatorial appointee.
Okay. I'm gonna kind of open it up for members of the committee that want to ask questions. Senator Bryan for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have been looking for just the dollar amount of the payroll from year to year. I can't find that. I'm sure that's somewhere. Could you just get for me the dollar amount of payroll over the years?
We can. As far as the PERS covered payroll, I'm gonna try to find it. I'm gonna ask the vet if she wouldn't mind, maybe look at it in case I can't. I want to say it's around 7 billion. I'll tell you what, if it's okay with you, if we can.
No, I just want to see how it's changed over the years.
Yes,
Okay,
we can
thank you.
do that.
Do you know what the normal cost of the current program is expressed as a percentage of payroll?
I do. Yes, sir. Give me just a minute. With the latest published report, this will be the as of last fiscal year with a new assumption and published in December, the normal cost is going to show up as 2.62%. Plus the 9, that amount. So it's going to be 11.62%, but 9 of that is paid for with the employee contribution. The 2.62 is what you'll see in the actual.
Let me see if I understand this. If we, I think this is what this means. If we were starting this system from scratch, it would take 11.62% of payroll, wherever you get that from, employees, employers, or whatever, to maintain the current system.
That's correct.
So everything that we're putting into this over 11.62%, and since the employees are putting up 9% of that, the employer contribution that's going toward maintaining this system is 2.62%. And the other 15% of payroll, whatever it figures out to, is going to amortize the debt.
That's right. The great majority of the employer contribution rate is going to pay that 25 billion, or as you said, to amortize the debt.
And so the problem, it seems to me, that we have is the unfunded liability or the debt or whatever term you want to use. The problem is not the cost of the existing system. There may be some reasons you want to change the existing system, but the problem is not the cost of the existing system. The problem is the accumulated debt over the years.
That's correct. The biggest challenge is certainly the 25 billion that is built up over time, over decades. Yes, sir.
And those of you on the board are required by law to pay the benefits that you're paying.
Yes, sir.
And those of you on the board are required by law to maintain the system as actuarially sound.
That's correct.
And the only method the board has of raising additional revenue, other than improving earnings and that, is to assess payroll.
That's correct. That is the lever, the only lever we have. And in taking those actions in the last few years, we're just simply complying with our statutory or fiduciary duty, and fiduciary duty.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to point out that this increase in assessment on payroll is caused by the laws of the state of Mississippi and the laws of math. And, you know, we want to talk about the laws of the state of Mississippi. We all know where they come from. It would seem to me that one of the major things about the system that's unfair is age. There's no consideration at age of time of retirement, which is to say, if I go to work in my 20s, work for either 20 or 25 or 30 years and retire, then I can start drawing in my 50s. If I go to work in my 30s and work for 25 or 30 years, I can start with drawing benefits 10 years later. So you got two people with exactly the same experiences, hired exactly on the same day, had the exact same contributions, the exact same salaries, the exact same employer's contributions. But at age of retirement, one is 56 and one is 66. And the 56-year-old is going to have 10 years of drawing and compounding that the 66-year-old isn't going to get on average. So I say that to say this has been a problem for years. And Mr. Chairman, I would hope that if we do anything at all to set up a new tier, there's something in that tier to take into account age at time of retirement, which I think most systems do. I'd just like to say as a personal matter, for what I'm doing personally for the system, is there two things I personally can do to help the system. One is to remain a member and keep paying in as long as I possibly can. The second would be to die very quickly after retirement. I have chosen, Mr. Chairman, to emphasize the first of these. I'm putting all my efforts into maintaining myself as a member of the system and to keep paying in. I just have one other thing, Mr. Chairman. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that once upon a time, the legislature set up a retirement system for the highway patrol. And the benefits awarded by the legislature were greatly in excess of the amount of funds that were being paid into the highway patrol system to keep it going. And I think what the legislature did at that time is they found an additional stream of revenue to help support the highway patrol retirement system. And I think that's their contribution from traffic tickets, I believe, but wherever it comes from, it was a stream of revenue that comes in every year to shore up the highway patrol retirement system. And I would think that's one of the things that we should consider doing. The other question I have, if you can get this, is when somebody withdraws from the system, that reduces payroll. So that means whatever you're assessing payroll to make up for this debt goes up. And I've asked, and I don't know that y'all can or have been able to compute this, but for example, we privatized the liquor warehouse. And when we privatized the liquor warehouse, that was an amount of payroll that was removed from the system. The unfunded liability, the debt attributed to the members at the liquor warehouse doesn't go away, it's still there. So that payroll is no longer there to support a portion of the unfunded liability. So that was forced back on to all the other employees. And the same thing happens every time somebody drops out of the system. Have I got that right?
That is correct. I think as far as the liquor warehouse, I believe that we did look into that. I think it's around 80, just for conversation's sake, around 82 positions and probably an average salary of around 35,000. That in of itself is a relatively small amount in the context of PERS. But the point in which you mentioned, you make, is just a reduction on a larger scale of the number of actives paying in. And speaking in terms of actives, I think over the last 10 years, the number of actives has decreased by 10 or 11%. And you're exactly right. That spreads you have to collect the same amount of money over a smaller remaining base of contributing employees, and it does raise the cost for those that are left. You're exactly right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Bryan. Any other questions from the committee? Senator Jordan for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to find out, on an average, how many people retire annually?
Say about 2,000 a year or so. I'd say around 2,000 a year. Get you a more
2,000.
exact number.
That's the total retirement on an average?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So person who's been paying into the system, I'm speaking on behalf of myself a long, long time, will anything be left for me?
Yes, we're going to make sure, if I understood you right, we'll make sure that your benefit is provided for sure.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
appreciate that statement.
And we'll firm up that first answer as well. We'll get you a better answer on that.
Senator Sparks for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Higgins, and I do appreciate you and your staff taking time to meet with legislators outside of session to discuss this a little bit in detail. So some of the questions I asked, I may have asked you before, but you mentioned one of the problems that we have, and you gave 4 major factors of investment loss. That's recession and the dot-com burst you referenced. Of the unfunded liability, what percentage or how much impact do you attribute to that, since you mentioned it first?
Sure. It's the last time we studied that, it was the largest percentage. I want to say from memory, it was around 30%, maybe a little more. I can say this, though, we had a study commission years ago. I want to say 2016, going back and looking at the growth of the unfunded and their contributors to that from 1998 to forward, and I think it was through 2016. Then we had it updated, the main numbers around 2019, so it's a little bit dated, but I think the answers will still hold true. Investment gains and losses was the leading one. I want to say it was 30-something%. The second leading contributor was the benefit changes.
Is there anywhere in our packet that you list the unfunded liability or debt, as it's been referred to, on an annual basis as a gross number?
I think so. We can look at that in the facts and figures. We may have to look at it and refer you to the right page, but there's a page in the facts and figures document that shows the unfunded from year to year to year to year.
And you referenced retirees versus actives and had a comment on that. How do you value it in the unfunded increase?
We'd actually have to go back and look at that one. That would probably be referred to as demographic experience, which is in that same study, but I can't quote that exact percentage off the top of my head, but it has had an impact, not as much as investments, not as much as the benefits, but does have it's definitely a contributing factor.
And the 4th factor you mentioned was conservative approach. And we had a rate of return that was anticipated. So we're guessing. It's an educated guess, but we're saying this is our rate of return, and that rate of return was 8% 4 years ago, 5 years ago. Is that correct?
Something like that, maybe a little bit longer than that, but you're right. And it was 8% for years, and it went to 7.75 and then 7.55 and then now 7, but it was 8% for years.
So at the second,
2015, I think.
Okay.
So when it changed.
at the moment you lower the expected rate of return, your quote, debt and unfunded liability increases by millions, if not billions, correct?
That's right. If you lower the assumed rate of return, the unfunded would increase.
So the fact that we have changed the rate of return, and I'm not saying that that's not the proper decision. I want to be very clear, because at home, people who are PERS recipients just want to know the check is going to keep coming. But it's unfair to imply that we've lost billions of dollars, because that reflects back on investment losses, which we have had. But of the debt, which is now at 32, 31 billion, is that correct?
Well, 25 billion, the unfunded.
25 is the unfunded. How much of a change moving from 8 to 7 did it increase that debt?
I'd have to go back and look at that to confirm, but I do know this year's change is the large majority of the change from 20 up to 25 billion, roughly speaking, is due to the assumption change. I'd have to go back and look from the 8 to 7, but
we're talking billions of dollars. We're talking $4 or $5 billion this year because of that actuarial change, correct?
that's correct.
All right. Who is the actuary? You've referenced there's an actuarial recommendation. Where's this recommendation coming from, and how long have they been making recommendations to PERS?
Sure. It's Kavanaugh McDonald is the consulting actuary firm. Very good firm, has a lot of experience, not only with PERS, but with many other public pension plans nationally. I think I read somewhere not long ago that they were the the second as far as the various consulting actuaries nationally, based on the calculation of liabilities under consultation, if you will. And as far as how long they've been doing it for PERS, a long time, I would say pushing over 10 years. I'd have to look that up, but for a long time. But they're a good actuary firm, and they, like I said, one of the largest. Do a lot of work with a lot of other states. I think Alabama uses them, Georgia uses them, many others. And one thing I'll mention, if I can, while we're on the topic, we also, even though we appreciate working with our consulting actuary, we, in addition to the regular annual audits that we do each year, financial statements and so forth, which definitely takes a look at the actuarial information each year, we do a specific actuarial audit every 5 years with another large-scale actuary firm to audit our consulting actuary. But to your question, it's Kavanaugh McDonald.
And
for
the
quite some
reason,
time.
the reason I ask that is because it's my understanding our rate of return for 22, based on prior year's packets, was 8.54. In 23, it was 7.76. We've exceeded the 7-year rate of return. If we continue to exceed that, we are actually paying off that debt, are we not?
Yes, sir. If I understand you right, anytime that we would exceed the assumed rate of return, you should have an actuarial gain, which would help pay that off more. And if I could, just to go back to one of your comments earlier, if I understood it right, I just wanted to thank you for recognizing that difference in the growth in the unfunded this year, that change in the funded ratio is not because of an investment loss or something like that. It's just simply the change in that assumption. But it's very important to have good assumptions, and I may come back to that in a minute, but I just wanted to thank you for that, if I understood you right.
Because what's going to be asked of this committee and ultimately of the legislature is infusion of cash, which is tax dollars. It's increase of employer or employee percentages of contribution. That's how you get more money. But I'm going to go back to the reliance on these actuaries. In 2022, in this very hearing, we were 61% funded, and some actuary somewhere said in 2047, we'd be 93% funded. The reason I bring that up is because if we're relying on the same actuaries today, who 2 years ago, somebody told us we'd be fine, I'm a little concerned with that because the recession and the dot-com had happened a decade earlier. So whatever losses that had been experienced had not been experienced. And honestly, what happened since 22 was that we lost $3.4 billion in investments from 21 in the fiscal year 21 to 22. I just want to make sure when we're asking for millions and millions of dollars for this system, that we're relying on serious numbers. And I know these folks are paid a lot of money to do this, but I still can't reconcile how whoever was given recommendations told us that in 22, because my concern going forward, we talk about you mentioned the benchmark. I'm not real interested in exceeding the benchmark because I don't know where you set the bench. It's based on 7%. If 7% is the rate of return expected, if we're above 7, we're buying down the debt. If we're below 7, we lost money that year based on the actuarial accounting. But the last part of that is we talked about it. We've called it debt. It's an unfunded liability, but we're calling it debt, and we use the word amortization. It's a big fancy word. Will you tell us what that means? Does it mean the number of years we're trying to pay this debt off?
Well, amortization is basically using a set amount of periodic payments over time to pay off a liability. So that's how I would summarize the concept of amortization. As far as the amortization period, I believe in the last actuarial report, it's around 32 years. We could look that up to confirm,
But does that affect our percentage funded? Because if I set up a 15-year mortgage for my house versus a 30-year mortgage for my house, my payment on the 15-year mortgage is going to be a whole lot higher. So have we changed our amortization toward the unfunded liability? Has that changed in the last decade?
yes, we changed in the current version of the funding policy, which would be the last version of it, which I believe was adopted around 2018, and including some additional metrics to measure it. One was the ADC, or the ADEC ratio metric, and in that, for the purpose of the calculation of the ADEC, we moved to a closed amortization approach, and then also 25-year for future, at that time, what would have been future actuarial experience. That's a great example of one of those more conservative approaches to public pensions nationally, which is a good thing for the system, a good thing for Mississippi, but does have a cost. So yes, and it was in the funding policy, an improvement to the ADEC ratio.
So in the last several years, we have lowered the rate of return a full percent, and we've shortened the period of time to pay off what we have as a debt. And the debt was exacerbated by the lowering of the interest rate. So some of this is on paper based on actuarials versus losing actual funds.
Well, definitely on some of the paper stuff. One thing I will say, and I really appreciate the questions and the detail and the inquiry, but one of the things I've learned is it's hard to talk about PERS in some ways, kind of on the fly or in shorter increments. So I welcome a longer, more in-depth discussion with me, you, and or others. I just want to be a little careful with that in mind. I hope to come back to comments about the actuary as well as the projection part. But you are right. Some of this is on paper. Now, it's very important paper, and I'll use the example of the assumed rate because that's the more recent one. That is the reason for that increase. That's the primary reason for the increase in the unfunded from last fiscal year to this year. That's the primary reason for that funded ratio change, but it's very important long-term to have good assumptions.
Thank you, Mr. Higgins. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Feeding off that real quick, what was the amortization period before you went to 25? Was it 30 years?
Well, this gets where it gets a little complicated, which is why I was having the call. So basically this is going to be confusing, I know. When we do our actuary reports, it's an open method. So that's why the amortization, if you were to look up the actuary report, it's going to change from year to year. But for the purposes of the calculation of the ADEC and the ADEC ratio, we do a closed method. And it would just depend on over time what the funding policy was on how we did it in the past. So I may need to follow up with you offline on that.
Did that closed calculation, did it change the years? Were you at a 30-year and went to a 25, or has it always been 25 years?
The current funding policy is new, starting in 2018, going to a closed approach. And at the time, the existing liability was amortized over 30 years. In future experience, we're going to have layered amortization and do it over 25 closed. That's not the one that's actually showing up in the actuary report because the nature of that metric is to make sure we're trying to balance out having a fixed contribution rate for budget planning purposes, say for the legislature, but not getting too far away from that ADEC. So the 25 closed is in the current and new policy, which is 2018.
Okay, so in 2017, you didn't have a policy on closed calculation, or that's what I'm trying to find out. In 2017, what was it? Was it?
It was open. It was open.
It was open. That was the only
I
one
was
you
here,
did.
but it was open.
So y'all added this closed calculation as a secondary approach to getting your funding ratio.
Yes, in accordance with the actuarial recommendations.
Okay.
And on that, if I could, Mr. Chairman, just want to mention, we believe that, there's always room to improve, but these are good numbers, good assessments, good reports, good actuaries, again, that work with many other public pensions. I appreciate the question. I appreciate the concern. We've been very transparent. We'll continue to be very transparent. And again, I appreciate the question, but we believe they're good numbers, good actuaries that are audited regularly. And the last audit, as it came to the big picture items about rates and liabilities and the key things, checked out clean. They do a lot of work with others. Just briefly, even though I hate to do it, but since it was mentioned, as far as the previous information with the projected, Senator Sparks is referring to one of our metrics in the funding policy, which is projected funded ratio in 2047. And a couple of years ago, coming off the record return year, that projection was higher. And, I know you and I have talked about that before, but my point is, I really want to emphasize, we think we have a good, solid actuary and numbers each year. And I would point out too, and you can find this in your information, that, like I said in the beginning, the big picture for PERS has been developing over time and has been essentially the same for many years. And the actuarial funded ratio has been roughly around 60% for over 10 years.
Senator Johnson for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the benefits, under expenses on page 5, it shows a little over $3 billion per year for benefits. What's the breakdown for COLA or regular payments?
Well, I know the COLA is around 900 million each year. The little over 900 million, and the great majority of that is in a lump sum in December of about 836 million. So the remainder would be the base benefit.
And are people paid on a calendar year or the state's fiscal year?
The COLA is calculated on a fiscal year. And then, of course, how they draw it will depend on what they choose. The COLA is outlined in statute, and the default option is for it to be a lump sum in December unless they opt to receive it monthly. but it's calculated on a fiscal year, and then it would be paid monthly in their benefit or in one lump sum in December. So it depends. But it's a fiscal year calculation.
And how does the cash flow work? I'm not familiar with what your investments would be for more liquid, to be liquid. What do you do for making payments?
Sure. Well, the overall cash flow, as we look at it in some of our metrics and stuff, not counting the investment side, just looking at contributions coming in and benefit payments going out. We do, in that respect, not counting investment income, do have a negative cash flow, which is not uncommon for a mature public pension like PERS. We pay out over $1 billion more in benefits annually than we receive in contributions. To the investment part, it depends. Some in private equity and real estate are very illiquid, and there's a long investment horizon, and we have a schedule for those things, but it's not very liquid to get it. But we'll have a large percentage in public equities that are more liquid, and also in fixed income. And so it really just depends on the investment class. But we have a mixture of liquid and very liquid and short-term accounts, as well as illiquid vehicles.
What kind of rate of return are you getting on the short-term investments?
This past year, it was a little around 5% or a little over 5%. I think, with interest rates being up as far as the short term, that's not always the case, but this past year it was over 5%.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Senator Bryan for a question.
I was listening to what Senator Sparks was saying, which sometimes can be helpful, I think it would be useful if we could compute the current situation with the system, assuming an 8% rate of return, not suggesting that we should go back and adopt an 8% rate of return, but at least that would, if I'm thinking right, that would sort of help answer the question I think Senator Sparks is asking, which is how much of this is due to a change in assumptions and how much is due to other factors. Again, not to suggest that we go back to 8%, but just so that we have that to talk about. But thinking about Senator Sparks's question, the actuaries make a whole series of assumptions, and we've been focused on the assumption they make about rate of return. But many, many years ago, back when I was newly elected, had some hair, had some sense, until it's all gone. But way back when I was first elected, I was looking over their assumptions, and they had life expectancy tables from the 50s. And so I said, it looks to me like they're basing this on life expectancy tables that were out of date. And I was reprimanded and said, oh, no, they're good people over there. They wouldn't do that. Okay, but right here on this piece of paper, it says that's what. So they changed the life expectancy tables, and that cost a couple of years of unfunded liability. That was not a change in what's going on in the real world. That was a change in the assumptions they were making. But the assumption that I don't know, but I think the assumption that might make a great deal of difference is what the assumption was about the increase in payroll over the years. Because I think that the assumption was that payroll would increase more than it has. And that's why I'd like to just look at the amount of payroll over the years. And if you could go back in some of the earlier years and look at what the assumption was about rate of increase in payroll. Again, that's just something that'd be useful for us to look at.
Sure, absolutely. We'll do that. And we have some of that as far as the assumption changes. I just don't know it off the top of my head, but that's a great point for both of you. We'll make sure and do that and get that to you.
And finally, Mr. Chairman, just two things. Number one, I think that if we would look carefully at what's going on with these lump sum distributions at ages 25 or years 25 through and higher, I think that's having an impact on the system because as Senator Sparks points out, I think the assumptions about rate of return may affect the dollar amounts of those withdrawals. And I also think the withdrawals are not made randomly, but I think if for whatever reason, I think I have short life expectancy, I'm a lot more likely to take out that lump sum distribution than if I'm planning on living a long life, which I am, but only after building up sufficient years of service in the system. And the other thing, Mr. Chairman, this is just off the wall, but there continues to be this concern about having to generate a large amount of cash in December for the 13th check. State agencies pay money into the system, and I think they pay it in on a monthly basis. We could, just as a matter of procedure, have state agencies pay in more contributions in the first 4 months of the fiscal year. That would all wash out at the end of the year, but it would be a source of at least some additional cash coming into the system in the early months, so they would have it there for payment in December. That might be of some, let them earn a little bit of income on that money and also ease what they say are their cash flow problems.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Horn for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Higgins, other states are having similar problems to Mississippi right now?
Yes, sir, that's correct. I mean, each state's unique in its own way, but certainly we're very much in the mainstream with our processes and the way we do things. And many states have some of the similar challenges.
And are they proposing similar changes to their system to what you're proposing today?
I would say yes. There have been a lot, maybe not this year, I'm not exactly sure, but I know over the last decade, certainly since the Great Recession, there's been a lot of pension reform, a lot of COLA reform, things like that. Each state and system is different, but there have been very similar changes in other types of pension reform.
Is there a state that's is similar to Mississippi that in demographics or at least in workforce that's having a similar problem? And if so, what have they done to improve their system?
Well, two that come to mind, and I don't know if Louisiana, of course, next door is one that comes to mind. I know they have some funding challenges. And one thing that comes to mind that we learned recently is I think in the last year or so, they passed a referendum to increase the minimum of surplus funds to go toward the unfunded liabilities of their pension systems. Another state which may not match up
Could you
demographic.
explain describe what you just said? What is that?
So, we have the 25, but we have the actuarial unfunded liability, which is the number we've talked about, which is roughly 25 billion. And Louisiana has several pension systems, and they have unfunded liabilities as well. And from what I understand, in the last year or so, they passed a referendum to increase the minimum amount of state surplus funds from year to year that needs to be appropriated to go toward paying off those unfunded liabilities. Another state that comes to mind that's further away and that may not match demographically as well, but it's a unified system, one way or the other, is Colorado. And by unified system, I mean like here in Mississippi PERS, everybody is in PERS. Some states have a teacher system, a regular state employee system, a first responder, law enforcement type system, whereas here in Mississippi PERS, basically all non-federal positions are in Mississippi PERS. Colorado's a unified system, and they implemented some pension reform and some COLA reform years ago. So those are two that come to mind, among others.
So you didn't propose taking our state surplus and putting it toward the system. Is there a reason for that?
I didn't quite hear the last part of that question.
You didn't propose taking our surplus cash and putting it toward the unfunded liability.
We didn't specify it, but we certainly request consideration of funding, realizing that the state has many needs, but we do, as we understand, there is a surplus, as you indicated, and we request a consideration of funding, some of that going toward helping PERS and the unfunded.
If we don't do anything this year, what happens next year, and what will happen to our pension fund in the next 5 years?
Well, as it stands now, the employer contribution rate would continue to rise 2% per fiscal year until it reaches 22.4%. So that's one thing that would continue to increase funding coming into the system. But also, as it stands now, the required contributions based on the current reports and projections and assumptions, the unfunded is projected to continue to rise, as well as the contribution requirements.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So back to what you were saying to Senator Sparks, if we hit our number, our 7% number and greater with the funding ratio going to 19.4%. Every year we do that, we're lowering the unfunded liability without putting a penny in.
Well, there's so many things that go into it. And it's not to dodge the question, but there's so many factors. As we often say, PERS is a complex issue with a lot of moving parts. And there's so many other things, Senator Bryan even alluded to some that go into that unfunded calculation. So I can't just do it straight up. But what I can say as it relates to the assumed rate of return, if you're not counting smoothing or anything, as it relates to the assumed rate of return, anytime you exceed that, you should have an actuarial gain as opposed to an actuarial loss, just referring to that assumption only.
And the actuarial gain should go towards the debt, the unfunded liability, in theory.
In theory.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Subert, do you have a question? Okay. Any other questions from any of the members? I do, you had mentioned, I'll kind of end with this one, but of all the changes y'all are requesting, you mentioned the fifth tier. Real quick, can you kind of give us an overview of what the request is with the fifth tier?
Sure. So it'd be a tier 5. Right now we're on tier 4. By tier, we're just talking about when you were hired into PERS. So a new benefit structure would be tier 5. So when we say that, we're just talking about a change in benefit for future hires. And the way we're requesting it is it would be just like current tier 4, just like PERS, the person hired yesterday, except it would be 4-year vesting for a benefit instead of 8. They would have a reduced member contribution rate of 7 instead of 9. And then there would be no guaranteed COLA, but rather it'd be the possibility of a COLA tied to inflation, capped at 3%, and also based on funding availability at the time.
Okay, so the employee portion would go from 9 to 7. And I was trying to write that down. So you're taking their contribution down to 7%. You're taking the vesting period from 8 to 4 years.
That's correct in this proposal.
Okay. And a possibility of a COLA. What does that look like?
So right now, the statute, the COLA, the additional benefit currently commonly referred to as the cost of living adjustment is set in statute, and it's 3%. It's 3% simple up to a certain age and then 3% compounding after that. And it's set in statute and it's guaranteed and it happens regardless of what's going on in the economy, going on in the world, or the fund status. What this would propose is that it'd be the possibility of a COLA. It'd be a may as opposed to a shall, so that for the tier 5 individuals in the future would have the possibility of a COLA, but it'd be more of an ad hoc COLA instead of a guaranteed COLA. But if so, it would be tied to CPI, tied to inflation, capped at 3%, and then also making sure that the system and state could afford it. So it'd be a may versus a shall, be the possibility as opposed to a guarantee for those future hires.
Who holds the may?
Holds the bank? Or
Who holds the may? May
Holds
give
the-
a
holds the bank.
COLA.
Well, the way we've proposed it is it'd be a combination of statute and legislation changes, a combination of statute and regulation. The way we've proposed it's a brief change in law that says something similar to what I said, but it would outline a few key parameters in the law, which would be the may, as well as the requirement for it to be tied to inflation and actuarial valuation and things like that. But then much like many other sections of the PERS system, it would charge the board to develop rules and regulations to carry out that section. And that's where the detail could come in on the measurement of inflation or the measurement of funding availability, things like that. So it would depend. The way we've proposed it currently is a combination of statute and regulation. The may would be in
The
statute.
board would ultimately have the authority of granting a COLA.
Under this proposal, but based on certain parameters that would be outlined in statute. Certain limitations or what.
But the board is the one that gives the thumbs up or thumbs down
Yes,
based on
Under this.
everything you just said.
Under this proposal.
Okay. All right. Well, we will dive into that at a later date and get more information on this and some of the other changes that you're proposing. Are there any other questions from the committee? All right, seeing none for a motion. Motion is rise and report. All those in favor say aye. All opposed? Ayes have it.
Thank y'all. Thank you.